This week on The Futurists, Doug Shapiro.
Derivative will be commoditized. The derivative is what generative AI is excellent at, is making things that are something like something else. And so what will be more scarce and more valuable is truly original, compelling stories.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tersick, and this week I'm flying solo as my colleague Brett King is traveling, as he tends to do. And when he travels, it gives me a chance to catch up with people that are on my list that I've wanted to talk to for a mighty long time. And today, we're going to have a conversation with someone I've wanted to have on this show for more than a year. I'm so thrilled to have Doug Shapiro join us. Doug is a prolific Substacker, one of my favorite newsletters to read because it's a topic that I care deeply about, which is the future of media and entertainment. And that world is going through traumatic change right now. But I suspect that what's on the other side of that change is going to be abundance and some good fun. So without further ado, welcome, Doug. It's great to have you on The Futurist. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Doug, you've been in this space for a mighty long time. I know you were an executive at Time Warner, where you're an analyst, so you were focused on like what comes next and helping do strategic planning. But then you set off on your own. So tell me a little bit about your trajectory since then and how you became a prolific Substacker and one of the leading thinkers about the future of media.
Well, I don't know where you got that line from. I guess
I made it up. Yeah, my show.
Mom
I can do that.
Told you that one. Well, I'll go back a little further. So I've been in and around media for 30 years. I was an analyst on Wall Street, covering media stocks for, roughly 14 years. And then I went to Time Warner. I was there for 12 years. Wow. I ran investor relations. I did some strategy roles. My last role was running strategy for Turner. And so when I left, I did a couple things, took a sabbatical for a year, took a try at a SPAC, which was a good learning experience.
Yeah.
A failed SPAC. But really the reason I started writing was to replicate what I had as an analyst, which is I learned early on, kind of accidentally, that writing is just a great forcing function for learning. I don't know if you get the sense when I write, but I'm not writing to convey what I know. I start out with a question, and then I use the writing process to try to wrestle an answer to the ground. And also on Wall Street, you have a really taut feedback mechanism because there's a lot of money at stake. So you write a report and you get yelled at, or people love it, or whatever. The stock goes up, stock goes down. And so, I said, well, how do I replicate that kind of forced learning and feedback mechanism? And I'm like, wow, there's this thing called the internet, and it's a relatively new phenomenon that you can just put your ideas out into the world. And so that was really the genesis of it, nothing more than that.
And what has the response been? Is it generally positive, or do you have your share of critics?
There's definitely critics. I mean, that kind of goes with the territory. I'd say, I gauge the worst thing that can happen is indifference. So I gauge the response by, just levels of engagement and,
Vitriol is good. It's a sign of high engagement.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if people are yelling at me, then that at least means they're paying attention. But I think generally people are supportive. What I'm trying to do, which I think is different, is really look at the fundamental structural changes that are underway. There's a lot of noise in media, as you know, and there are a lot of people dissecting what happened yesterday and this earnings report and that earnings report. And my view is that if you really understand what's happening on a fundamental level, on a kind of a first principles level, then that helps you kind of at least like determine the probability distribution of how the world might evolve. But it also is a really useful tool for filtering all the noise, right? Because you have at least a context with which to interpret new information.
This is a really important point because, on this show, one of the things we want to do is help our listeners develop a better understanding of the future and the forces that shape the future, effectively to think more effectively about the future. And one of the things I run into persistently is, particularly if I'm working on client work where people want my advice or they want my perspective about the future, I always start with long term trends and I take a look at history, especially the history leading up to how we got to the moment we're in. That's not necessarily a foolproof way of forecasting, but at least it shows you the context within which these changes are occurring. And there's really two things for media that I think really are quite important if we want to talk about the future. The first one is the trends. Of course, you have lots to say on that subject. And then secondly, the value control points. The media industry has always been controlled by value control points. Large media companies are large because they control several value control points, in the media supply chain. Everything from financing to access to stars to access to IP and the resources to produce and the ways to distribute and market. However, the trends are shifting those value control points, or they're shifting value away from those points to other points. And this is where I find so much value in the work that you're doing, in the writing that you're doing, because an astute reader can read your newsletter and start to see what direction value is shifting towards. And then you can start to see those as opportunities to find a new value control point, maybe seize it, and that's a way to build a new business or to generate profit in the future. For those who are listening, if this sounds interesting to you, I can tell you that the newsletters are brilliantly written. They're succinct, yet they're packed full of information. The newsletter is called The Mediator. It's on Substack, and it's by Doug Shapiro, and that should be enough information for you to find it. Okay, so Doug, give me the big picture. What's happening right now in the media landscape? Give me a couple of bullet points, and then we'll drill deeper.
Well, the one sentence summary that I use is that the last 15 to 20 years in media were really defined by the disruption of content distribution, and that the next decade plus is going to be defined by the disruption of content creation. So that's the one sentence version.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you go back, what you'd say is that there were really two foundational technological changes that happened really starting kind of in the 40s, 50s, but implemented in the kind of 80s, 90s through the early 2000s, which was one was digitization and the other one was the internet. And what digitization did was it broke down the silos in media, because it used to be that, all media had a different, atomic unit, right? Like what's the
Disc
atomic,
or a disc
well,
or a
even as like
book or
a
something.
note or a note in music or a frame or in a photograph or video or whatever. And what digitization did was it made the atomic unit of all media the bit, right? And then what the internet did was it unified all those bits on one network. So instead of having all these, modality or format specific distribution network supply chains, you basically had one. You had one network, more or less one form factor. And so what that did is it really changed the architecture of media. It changed the way, first, digitization converted all media to bits, and the internet changed how those bits move around. And so what that did, it did a bunch of things, but the critical thing it did is that it changed the cost of media distribution from really expensive to it put it on a path to be functionally free. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason is because the internet unbundled the information from the infrastructure. It used to be that you need to own this really expensive underlying infrastructure, whether that was a broadcast antenna or hybrid fiber coax cable or a very specialized newspaper supply chain or whatever it is. You didn't need to own any of that anymore to be in the media distribution business. And so you can trace that
One can go to
shift.
Substack and publish a newsletter,
You
for
can go to Substack,
instance,
exactly. Where does
for
Netflix
free.
come in? Axios and Spotify and every, most of what we talk about today in media, everything that's really emerged in the last, 20 some odd years have all essentially they're all riding on infrastructure that somebody else paid for. So you have that foundational change of the cost of bits going from really expensive to on a path to be functionally free, and that led to what I call the tectonic trends in that exist in media today, the kind of low background hum of operating in the business, which is number one, you have deflation, price deflation, right? There's a lot of pricing pressure. You have stagnation of time spent. A third one is you have fragmentation of attention. And a fourth one is disintermediation of traditional intermediaries, which is what you were just kind of referring to. And then the fifth one is what I call concentration of power in a few platforms and attention in a handful of hits. So that's a lot, and we could unpack any of those you want to, but
Yeah. Yeah,
I think
that's pretty
that's
much the agenda for the show there, right
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. So I think that again, just to draw the thread here, you have
Mhm.
these foundational technological changes, general purpose technologies, incredibly broad implications across the economy. This is what they do to media. This is the state of media today. And most of what we talk about in media today is a lagging indicator of that last disruption, right? All
Right.
of those trends are a lagging indicator of what happened over the last 20
Actually,
plus years, and there's
great point.
another and well I'll finish. And there's another disruption coming,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
that's the disruption in the cost of content creation.
Yes.
So that's the kind of full, that's the that's the
That's
outline
great.
of the full picture, and happy to go
It's
anywhere
excellent. Well,
you
you
want.
just framed the whole conversation. So let me recap it. Let me spin it back for those who are listening. So Doug just talked about 5 factors that have completely revised the way we distribute, the way we package, distribute, and sell content, and thereby tremendous number of consequences for the media industry and the companies that produce it. We're going to cover that. We're going to go back to each of those 5 points in a second. But then Doug just pointed to another major trend that we're just at the very beginning of, which is the advent of automation of the creative process. And that's code for AI, the topic that keeps coming up on the show week after week after week. We can't seem to avoid it because it's everywhere. But in the media business, it actually has some pretty profound implications. So we'll cover the AI part in the second half. But first, let's just get into and unpack those 5 points. The first one you talked about is price deflation. And that's a big one because, when I was coming up in the media business, cable TV was coming up at the same time, and that's where I started. And there was a very clear hierarchy when I came to Hollywood and joined a movie studio. At the top of the pyramid was the motion picture business, the movie company. That was the prestige department. Those people had all the stars and all the money. Then there was the TV people, and they were the second, in line, or the next ones down the rung. And then there was cable, which was kind of like the bargain basement of television. No one got any respect for working in cable, though we made all the money for the rest of the company. And then I was in the internet department, which was like really the sub basement, if you will. And I went from that sub basement to mobile. And mobile at the time was hopelessly degraded as far as the media business was concerned.
Dungeon.
But even then, in the '90s, it was quite clear to me because I was looking at the number of units. I worked at Sony Pictures, so I was a liaison to Sony hardware, and I saw the number of units we were selling in mobile phones even in the '90s. And I was like, well, it's just a matter of time before billions of people have these things, and it's going to invert that whole power pyramid. And here we are today, and that's absolutely the case. Where the motion picture company, there's no prestige in the movie business anymore. It's in tatters. They are, all movie chains are bankrupt right now. The theatrical experience is in disarray. Even the prestige talent is migrating to streaming because that's where they can tell a 26-hour show instead of a 2-hour show, which is for a writer, or director, or actor a way better showcase of their talent. And all of those money makers, the blockbuster films, the broadcast networks, and particularly cable, which was the biggest driver of revenue and profit for Time Warner when you were there, all of that now is in tatters. All of that is in disarray. So talk to me about price deflation and then the consequences of that for the media business.
Yeah, and what I'm referring to is not new at all, right?
No.
I worked with Jeff Zucker for a while at Time Warner, and in 2008, when he was running NBCU, he had this famous line that he warned the big media companies not to trade analog dollars for digital dimes. So that was 17 years ago when he warned that. I think that what's a little surprising is how persistent it is. And so I recently wrote a piece about this, about price deflation in media. And what I showed is that if you look at um, if you look at monetization per hour, you see that linear TV is still monetizing, 50% higher than Netflix per hour, and it's
Mhm.
like 3 times as much as YouTube per hour. In gaming, you see the same thing with console gaming. It's still monetizing much higher than PC or mobile. And in music, if you think about what people used to spend per minute of consumption when they bought a CD versus what they're spending now per minute or per hour of consumption on Spotify, it's probably like 10x. And so I think that what's surprising is, like let's take TV as an example. Netflix has been raising prices for years. I think some would say relatively aggressively, and yet still that gap persists. So I think that what is, in some ways, if you just think about it from like an econ 101 standpoint, you'd say the barriers to distribute fell. There's more content. There's more supply. Prices go down. And that's, I think a relatively that is what's happened. I think that what's surprising is that we're 20 years into this disruption and it persists.
Back in the late '90s, John Malone, kind of the godfather of the cable
Cable
business.
cowboy, yeah.
Yeah, he said to me, he said the cable TV business model is the greatest mechanism ever invented or ever devised for profit maximization in media, and that is a really great succinct statement. And what you had was two groups that didn't necessarily like each other or get along, but they had a perfect alignment of interests: the channel providers and then the cable distributors. And because it was private infrastructure and essentially monopolistic in nature, they were able to extract monopoly pricing. They were able to extract the monopoly rent. And anyone who was around at that time remembers how much people hated their cable company, particularly TCI, which gave the worst service and charged the highest prices.
Yeah.
So that did really well at the time, but it only worked because it was a closed system. And so the opening up, not just YouTube, but generally the opening up that you described with the internet, destroyed monopoly pricing control. And so that's one of the reasons why we've seen the deflation. That's one of the reasons why YouTube doesn't monetize at the level of broadcast TV. What that also points to is that there's a lot of life left yet in television, both in pay TV, satellite, and cable, and in broadcast. These businesses are not dead. They're not growing, but they're coming down from such a great height. There's plenty of money there for a long time. You probably wouldn't go into that if you were 22 years old because it's not a growth industry. But I don't think you can say that those are dead and done. I say that because often I see stuff on LinkedIn or on Instagram where people say, "Oh, it's over. Hollywood's finished. The TV business is done." Those people are ignorant. That's just not true. And by the way, I don't think any of this stuff is going to destabilize Hollywood in the way popular imagination thinks it will happen. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So you talked about
Well,
stagnation of time.
maybe just to follow up on
Yeah,
that, because
sure.
I agree with all of that. I think just to maybe bring it home a little bit for me, I think there's a couple of implications of this deflation that are worth pointing out. One is that when you see disruption, it often shifts value to consumers, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like if prices are lower, what that means is that consumers are getting more for their money, right? So if you think about a value chain that includes consumers, you'd say value has shifted to consumers, right? Um, and I'm trying to remember what the other example, what the other point.
Well, I mean, the example there is just take streaming, right? So the crazy streaming war we've seen for the last 10 years, billions have been spent on programming that you can't possibly consume, right? No one
Yeah,
can watch all the stuff that's available on Netflix, Disney Plus, Max, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, that's a wasted, that's an inefficient spend.
yeah,
But on the other end, like you said, at the end of the value chain is the consumer. That's an unbelievable bounty of content. We
yeah,
have this content abundance, and it's quite good. Like most of the quality of the content is quite good.
yeah.
It's not very time efficient. You have to spend 10 hours to figure out what the show is even about. But if you're entertained by it,
Yeah,
that can
no.
be a
So
good time.
value has shifted to consumers. I think the other point I was going to make is that um, because of this price pressure, there's just less money in the system.
Yeah.
And I think that when you think about the problems in Hollywood, why production spend is coming down and why morale is so bad and why RSNs are, going bankrupt and why, there's controversy over the theatrical window, or why Scarlett Johansson sues Disney because of the way Black Widow was distributed, or, whatever, any of those things, they're really all occurring because there's now less money in the system than there used to be, and which means there's less money for everyone seated at the table, and that's a very so to your point earlier, I agree with you. There's still a lot of money in legacy media, and I did an analysis that if you look at the total video pie in the United States, which is all linear and streaming and theatrical and home video, 66 cents of the dollar is still linear TV. Right?
Yeah, that's true. Streaming
It's
doesn't
still
monetize at the level that any of those
no,
previous media did.
exactly. But it's also pretty wrenching when anything goes X growth. When things start to shrink, it becomes very wrenching to the system. And so, yeah, there's a lot of money that's still there, but it becomes it's very hard to go from it's very hard to go down. It's very hard
Oh no, look,
to,
we can put a real clear case on it. So, if you know folks who are writers who worked in television, when we were young men starting our careers, there were showrunners who made generational wealth with a successful show that they would be able to pass on to their family for the next 3 generations.
Right.
Today, that's simply impossible. That would not occur. Cable started, with cable, the shows were a total buyout. So you got paid producer fees, but you didn't get any back end, any kind of royalty. So if you made a hit show, sayonara, sucker, maybe we'll see you on the renewal, but otherwise you're not going to be getting any huge residuals or royalties. Streaming, they just put this blunt force mechanism in place of caps and bonuses, but no kind of royalties. So if the show performs, maybe you get a second check. That's nice, but you're not going to retire on that. So the shrinking of revenue has directly impacted the creative people who produce it. And now I'm sure there's folks listening thinking like, oh, really? I'm supposed to feel sorry for some screenwriter who lives in Malibu. But it's worth pointing out that there are some 400,000 people here in Los Angeles who are indirectly or directly engaged in the motion picture business. And so as that industry shrinks and as the salaries go down, actually it does change lifestyles for people. And the typical screenwriter gets paid, not a glorious wage, but if they're fortunate, they're going to earn $150,000 a year. So these changes do have an impact, and they hurt.
Yeah, and I think that's what you saw on the strikes. That what really this the writers and the actors were really they were really striking against disruption. They were
Wage
striking against the laws of
compression,
economics.
shrinking the writer's room, which means each writer has to work more. Again, it's pretty hard to feel sympathy for a latte sipping writer in a writer's room, but it actually does impact their lives. I mean, they end up having to do more work. So, okay, let's cover the other 4. Otherwise, we're going to burn the whole show on this topic, though. Obviously, we could go a long time. So, you talked about the stagnation of time, which is really the time spent with media. And what you mean by that is everybody's got a limited amount of time they can spend on entertainment. And now we have a lot more choices. So I guess tell me about what you mean there.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Right? It just if you look at time spent with media, at least in the United States right now, the average U.S. adult spends about 75% of waking hours with media. And that isn't, again, there's it gets a little bit hard to measure because there's this question of multitasking and double counting and all that. But most of our waking day, and it's not really growing anymore. It grew with the advent of mobile in 2008, and then it sort of leveled off, and then we had a COVID bump, and then since then it has not grown at all. So there's just only so many hours in the day, and ultimately that's just a structural constraint on the growth of media revenue, because media ultimately is about the monetization of attention and engagement. There's just not a lot of attention to go around.
That's right. Okay, so that one dovetails neatly with the next one, which is the fragmentation of attention across devices. So that, in the meantime, these last 30 years, we've been talking about the changes in the media business. This notion that you go sit down at 8 o'clock in front of the television in the living room, that idea is out the window. That's been dead and done for quite some time. Now we get media all the time on the device of our choice. We're standing in line at the grocery store. There's enough time to watch 2 TikToks. Yay, I suppose. We can always find a moment to squeeze in some mobile media. However, that also disrupts the industry, because television used to be on a TV and radio used to be on a radio and music used to be on a stereo. And now everything competes for attention on whatever device you happen to have in front of you. So this pits the media companies against each other in a sense, in a kind of a struggle or conquest for attention. It's literally television versus streaming audio versus a game. Which one is the consumer going to turn their attention to? And your attention is finite. That's just, everyone knows this is the scarcest resource. Is there more to say about that, or have we covered those two topics, fragmentation and
There's a lot more to
stagnation?
say about that. I would actually frame it differently than you did, because what's interesting is you can think about fragmentation in two ways. There's fragmentation between formats, and I mean between audio and video and gaming and whatever, print. Or you could think about fragmentation within formats. And what's interesting is you don't really see a lot of even though the way you framed it is, that radio is competing with TV, you actually don't really see that. If you look at time series of time spent by format, what you'd see is that video, gaming, audio, they're pretty stable year to year. There's not a lot of bleed between them, because I think they're different use cases. Like, you're not usually indifferent between playing Elden Ring and watching The Big Bang Theory or whatever. They're very different consumer need states.
Hmm.
Where you see the fragmentation really happening is within formats, and it's largely between corporate media and creator media. So, for instance, in video, you can see that right now, at least by my math, that roughly 25% of all video consumption in the US is social video. It is, YouTube, TikTok, and Reels. In music, an interesting thing to watch is that every year Spotify publishes in their 20F, in their financial filing, they publish what percentage of music streams come from the majors and Merlin. Merlin is a distributor of the largest independent distributor, and what percentage come from outside the majors and Merlin. And that latter number, it goes up every year. So if you went
Wow.
back to like 2017, roughly 90% of streams were the majors and Merlin, and last year it was like 70%. And so that just goes down every single year. You think about gaming, and you're seeing the same thing, that a decade ago mobile gaming didn't exist, and now mobile casual gaming is half of the industry. So there is a lot of fragmentation happening to creator media, and you'd say, well, why is that? And there's two reasons. One is obvious and one is less obvious and really important and insidious and worth watching. The first one is just there's an explosion of supply, right? So more stuff, our attention gets diverted in more places. That's kind of obvious. The one that's not as obvious is that you're starting to see evidence, at least you can infer, that the consumer definition of quality is shifting away from high production value, right? Because what's really growing across media, in video, what's growing is YouTube. In gaming, what's growing is Roblox. In music, a lot of what's growing is, functional music, study music, ambient music, whatever. All of these things shifting away from the traditional definition of quality, right? Like in TV, what's quality? Like if you ask the people I used to work with at Turner, they would describe an HBO show, right? Like high budget, well-known showrunner, famous actor, whatever. And so for those people watching this shift of attention toward YouTube, they're like, why are people watching that stuff that's
Yeah.
such crap? That's
Yeah.
low quality stuff. It is by your definition of quality, but by inference. If you think about quality not as some kind of, independent value judgment, but as revealed preference, then you can see, I mean, people are telling you that their definition of quality is shifting away from high production values. And
Yeah.
so that's really important when you think about the potential impact of Gen AI, because, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, but what you're really setting up for is two things happening at the same time. One is that production values are being somewhat democratized, or will be democratized by Gen AI, at the same time that consumers' emphasis on high production value is shifting, that their preference for high production value is declining. So that's a pretty dangerous combination.
Dangerous if you're a professional in the motion picture business.
If you're an incumbent, yeah. I think if
Yeah.
you're in
Okay.
traditional
Hey,
media, I
we have
think it's
2 minutes to cover the last two topics. So if you don't mind,
okay.
I'm going to shoehorn them in before we take a break.
Yeah, well, we could do
Those
those
were
quickly. Yeah, those are fast.
disintermediation and concentration.
Yeah. So disintermediation is just what you referred to, is that, historically most of the household names in media are middlemen between creatives and consumers, right? And they've made money, whether it's a music label or a studio or a publisher or whatever, they've made money because they do things that are really hard for creatives to do themselves. They finance production, they assemble talent, they do the marketing, they do the monetization, distribution. Technology is making it systematically easier for creatives to do those things themselves. And so what it does is it either shifts bargaining power to creatives. How does Ryan Coogler negotiate to get a rights reversion on a
Yeah.
movie, right? Why does Taylor Swift, able to say, I don't need a studio at all. I'm just going to make my own Eras tour movie and distribute it through AMC myself.
Good for her.
Or it enables people to disintermediate or circumvent the middleman altogether, and that's what you'd call a creator, right? So that one I think is pretty straightforward, and then we can move on to you could talk about that one, or we can move on to
No, keep going. You're doing great. We'll wrap it up with concentration of power, concentration of wealth, concentration.
Yeah, so concentration, and if you think about what I just said, you'd be like, well, hold on a second, let's keep me honest. So I just said that the internet is fragmenting attention, and I'm saying it's concentrating attention. How does that work? So because that would seem to be some kind of contradiction, I would think. And what I mean by that is that the internet didn't only unbundle information from infrastructure, it also connected everyone on a network. And the thing about networks is media used to be one way, right? You make something, you distribute it off to consumers, they consume it, they go home, right? Now everything's on a network. It's two-way. And so now there's this feedback loop. And every node affects every other node. And so you have these really powerful positive feedback loops, and they manifest themselves on the supply side and on the demand side. So on the supply side, they manifest as network effects, and you have these massively powerful platforms, Meta and Google and whatever, unassailable competitive position. And on the demand side, they manifest as these really extreme power law-like distributions of popularity. A few hits at the head of the curve, a very skinny middle, and there's almost infinitely long tail. And so what you're seeing there is, more and more power accruing to what you could call new gatekeepers, these new intermediaries on the one hand, and then on the popularity side, you see fewer and fewer of these big hits. You have Taylor Swift and Barbenheimer and GTA 6 and whatever, but this kind of infinitely long tail, and the middle is really getting compressed.
Yeah.
And that creates another problem for the incumbents, which is that they used to make a lot of money in the middle, right?
Yeah.
For one thing. The other thing is that the business is just getting riskier because the distribution of returns is getting wider, right? And then the third thing is that if you are the talent in the head of the curve, you know it, and you're going to extract more value. So it's shifting yet more bargaining power to the talent at the very, very tippy top of the curve.
Super summary of the major trends that are shifting value control and creating new locuses of value inside of the media supply chain. All right. Hey, Doug Shapiro, this has been so much fun so far. Now, folks, don't go anywhere. We're going to come back in a minute, and we're going to talk about the impact on creation, the automation of creation. This is going to be the more exciting part of the show, but this has been great so far. Doug, thank you very much. We'll be right back after these comments.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick, and this week I'm talking to Doug Shapiro. Doug's a media analyst, formerly with Time Warner, now on his own, and a prolific writer on Substack at The Mediator, a newsletter that I read and enjoy, and I hope you'll read as well. So I want to shift the topic a little bit. We were talking about the big trends that have reshaped the business model, economics, and even the content choices and the kind of the volume of content that we get to enjoy. Now, while that was a lively discussion, a lot of that was backward looking. Now let's look forward into the future. Let's talk about what's coming next. Topic you and I have talked about, you've written quite a bit about, is generative AI. So I suppose we should jump right in. AI comes up in almost every episode of The Futurists. So one of the strange things I find about artificial intelligence is there is a pattern of diffusion that we've seen with technologies, even the internet, which is that they tend to focus in one area, one domain, and then they expand from there. But what we're seeing with artificial intelligence is a little bit different in the sense that it's being shotgunned out to every industry at once. Part of that is because of the intense competitive dynamics. These major technology companies competing with small startups, and then everybody in the United States is competing with all the brilliant people in China. And open source models are competing with proprietary closed source models. So you have so many different layers or vectors of competition that it's forcing the companies in the AI space to find customers quickly. And what you're seeing is AI is proliferating through the entire economy, whether it's healthcare, banking and finance, transportation, shopping, commerce, even politics. And of course, the media industry is not immune to this trend. And this is an area that I'm very focused on in my career right now, as I'm highly committed now to generative AI in the motion picture and storytelling business. And so I thought we could have a conversation about that. First, I'd love to get your take on just what's happening right now, the state of generative AI, and then we can get into the future.
Sure, that's kind of open-ended.
Yeah.
I should add, I'm actually writing a book about this right now.
Oh, fabulous. Well, let me start you with a real specific question.
Yeah.
The Writers Guild, back in 2023, I spent a lot of time talking to writers because Netflix's office is right over there. It's about 5 blocks from my house. And so there were plenty of writers on the sidewalk there. And I know a lot of writers in the Guild as well. And I would have conversations with them. And this is just 2 years ago. And the conversation would go like this. ChatGPT is a menace. ChatGPT is a threat. ChatGPT is a plagiarism machine. ChatGPT is stealing our content. All these things that weren't actually true if you understand how it works. But that was the premise then. That was just 2 years ago. And I should also point out in 2023, ChatGPT wasn't very good. It was okay. It was more like a party trick or a gimmick. But here we are in 2025, just 2 years later, and there's been a big shift. Last year was the year, 2024 was the year where people started to get curious about it. And what I'm seeing right now in 2025 is in many lines of work, many lines of business, not just media and entertainment. Now companies are taking it seriously. For instance, Shopify, Toby, the CEO there, just sent a memo saying that everyone has to use AI. Everybody in the company has to start to use AI. And I'm seeing that happen in many other places. What's happening is from the top of the company, they're now starting to embrace it, and they're telling staff, figure out how to use it. And don't come to your manager or don't come to your colleague with a question. Start with the AI and start to learn it. I'm even seeing that, Doug, in the media business. So while the guilds are still firmly, officially opposed to AI, what I'm finding is a lot of people in the guilds, particularly younger members of the guilds, are coming to me saying, hey, can you tell me more about AI? I heard you're working on an AI project. How can that serve an artist? And I personally feel that the sky's the limit if you're a creative person, because this is going to give you superpowers to tell stories. People who can't make pictures can make pictures. People who aren't great writers can start to write with the assistance of an AI. So here I framed it for you a little bit. Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist about the near-term implications of creativity and AI?
It depends on the lens, but I think I agree with where I think you're going, or I think I agree with where I think you're going, which is
I think I agree. I'm where.
To me, one of the ironies of the strike is that I think of Gen AI as a much larger threat for the studios than for the writers. I think it is a democratizing technology, and if you think about how Hollywood works. High quality productions are so expensive that there's really only, I don't know, how many would you say? A dozen, half a dozen? There's not that many people who ultimately control what gets made and doesn't get made in Hollywood. It's a very small number. And now you have the potential for, as you said, anybody to make anything, theoretically, at least over time. Yeah. And so I think it's going to be... I'm extraordinarily optimistic about the implications for creative output, and I think when you think about what's happening in Hollywood, and I don't want this to sound critical because I think it's perfectly understandable, but as the business has been contracting, the people who hold the purse strings have gotten ever more risk averse.
Yeah.
And there's this, you remember the old, the intro, the first opening scenes of The Player, where you get as the viewer, you're eavesdropping on these writers' pitches, and they're saying, oh, it's Pretty Woman meets the Manchurian Candidate, or whatever, all these like preposterous things, and what they're skewering is Hollywood's tendency to lean on the derivative, right?
Yep.
Everything in Hollywood is derivative of something else, and that's only gotten much worse since then. And when you look at
The
things like
irony there, of
franchise
course, is that they
TV,
accuse AI of being a derivative work and of compiling
right.
and inferencing from the work of others and so on. I'm like, what is it that you guys have been doing for the last 100 years?
Exactly. So I think that you could have just an explosion of creativity, of new ideas, and I wrote a piece recently where I made the point that derivative will be commoditized. Derivative is what generative AI is excellent at, is making things that are something like something else. And so what will be more scarce and more valuable is truly original, compelling stories. And you're going to have new stories, you're going to have new formats, you're going to have, I think the other thing which not a lot of people talk about is the concept of generative AI as a new form. Typically, when we talk about it as a way of doing what we're doing now for less money, but which is also called skeuomorphism. Like typically, when you have a new medium, the first thing it does is it imitates the prior medium, right? Like the first films were televised stage plays, and the first time you read a magazine
Soap
online, it
operas
was like
came from radio to TV.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly, right. Um, and then what happens is that creatives start to, they come to understand the unique attributes of this new medium and then do things that are new. And so that will happen here too. Like when you think about the idea that with AI video that it will eventually be able to render in real time, right? What does it mean to be able to render in real time? Well, it means you could have true interactivity. When they filmed Bandersnatch for Netflix, they basically had to film four versions of the same thing. So what happens when you have, true interactivity, emergent stories, true personalization, contextualization? What does it mean when there are underlying world models or 3D models that are underlying these engines? And so at that point, everybody becomes a cinematographer because you could watch any video from any angle you want, right? Like, what does it mean to have worlds that are not bound by current, physics or whatever it is? I think we can't possibly imagine exactly what will emerge out of that. And the thing I always refer to as ASMR. I'm like, what is, people like listen to someone else eat a cookie, and I'm like, well, I'm so like was it mukbang, that like the eating large quantities of food. Anyway, there's some Korean YouTuber with 30 million subscribers who like eats, and that's the thing. And like, I'm like, who would have, I don't know who would have guessed that. I would not have guessed that. I still don't understand now, even that it's here. So, I think new things are going to emerge that could be really exciting and different. And
Yeah,
so
for all the
very,
grief that people give TikTok and YouTube, actually, those have been a source of great creativity if you're willing to look for it, right? And of course, there's plenty of
100%, yeah.
mediocrity. So there's a
Oh,
needle
yeah.
in the haystack issue. But this also goes back to your point about quality. I think one thing Google has taught us in the age of Google, quality is in the eye of the beholder, and quality is relevance. If it's relevant to you, if AMSR is your thing,
Yeah.
you need it,
Yeah.
to
It's
concentrate or whatever,
authentic. Is it relatable? Is it
then it's high
relevant to
quality.
but it
Yeah.
could be, sometimes it's FOMO. Sometimes it's because it's relevant to my sub community and I need to it's social currency. I need to know what's going on just to, there's all these different attributes that are emerging around, that are different from the historical, attributes of quality. Yeah.
Okay, let's go sector by sector or
Okay.
group by group and
Yeah.
talk about the implications for them. Let's start with creators because you talked about the cost of creation is going to go down. These tools are tools that can be used by a single person or a very small team. That's for sure true, right? They're already, let's say, good enough. They're not great. I don't think anyone would say these are cinema quality, but they're good enough for YouTube. They're certainly good enough for TikTok and Instagram Reels. So the creators, this is a win, it seems to me, for creators who want to tell stories, who want to make imaginary worlds. Right now, a lot of creator media is reality. right now, a lot of what's on TikTok and YouTube is basically a hybrid or weird variant of what used to be on reality television.
Yeah.
Just done with an iPhone and with regular people instead of like super buff people on an island.
Yeah.
And now those people who are making those shows, maybe if you're not super buff or not great looking like an influencer, then maybe you want to show pictures of other people, and generative AI fits the bill there. So if you're not telegenic enough to be a YouTube influencer, then maybe you can create one. That seems like a pretty plausible scenario, doesn't it? And I would imagine we're going to start to see that in the next months, not years.
For sure. I think that is already happening. I mean, you have like an early signal of that with little Michaela, or, it was making $10 million a year, and that's not generative AI.
Right. She doesn't exist. Just for those who don't know, little Michaela, $5 to $8 million a year doing Chanel ads and Dior ads, and she's just a Photoshop.
Yeah, exactly. But there's
Hatsune Miku, my favorite. Brett and I are crazy about Hatsune Miku. This is a person that doesn't exist who can sell out a stadium for a concert. 26,000 people go.
There is a but, and the but is that goes back to what we were talking about before, which is that there's only so much time in the day, there's only so much money to go around, and the power laws here are merciless. So you're going to have as the cost of production compresses, you're going to have an even greater explosion of content, and so that head will get higher, that tail will get ever longer, or at least the head will get relatively higher, and so it's going to be very, very hard for people to break through the clutter. And that's one of the things. We're not getting into that, but I think there is an open question. You see a lot of new generative AI or AI first studios emerging, and the question becomes, okay, well, you're getting into a business expressly because the barriers to entry are falling, but you're getting into a business in which the barriers to entry are falling. So what is the long term? You're getting into a business that will be more competitive because it's going to be easier. Could you have two kids in a dorm room in 5 years, let's say, make the equivalent of Avatar, right? Maybe.
Probably.
Maybe you could, right?
Yeah.
And
or
so,
something, it could be 80% is good or 60% is good, and it'll still chisel away at the audience of a blockbuster film.
That's 100% right.
It doesn't have to be a parody. I think that's a mistake sometimes people make. It's
100%. And that's that I think is a really critical point, which I know you've said before, is like, if you can make 80% of the quality at less than 10% of the cost, that's going to be enormously disruptive, especially when you couple that with what we were talking about before, which is that the standards of quality or the definition of quality is shifting. Yeah. So I think it's just an open question, right? Like if you're a new generative AI, if you're an AI first studio and you're getting into this business and saying, wow, look at these, fat numbers out there, Netflix is paying X for a show and I can do it for an order of magnitude less or whatever. That's a temporary arbitrage that ultimately as the production costs plummet, the economic, the pricing is going to fall too. If you're Netflix and you're line item auditing every budget, right?
Yeah, but the play there,
I
think the play there is like, this company Promise just released their first trailer. You've heard about Promise. They're supposedly an AI AI film studio. Yeah. There's about 50 of these companies now, maybe more. Charlie Fink tells me there's 80 of them. So, okay, there's a bunch of companies hanging out a shingle saying AI movie studio. First of all, I think that notion as a mark of distinction is going to fade in 18 months because everything's going to be AI. So like saying you're an AI studio is not really probably the best positioning.
Right.
But then Promise came out and showed a trailer. So it just hit this week for their first film, which is about ninjas. It's like Ninja Punks or something, I think it's called. And honestly, it landed with a thud because I saw it and I'm like, oh, okay, this looks exactly like the kind of trailer that you see when you're stuck in a middle seat on a long airplane flight. You look on the entertainment system, you're like, I don't recognize any of these films. I guess they're all straight to video. These films never got released. And here's one called Ninja Punks. And it's like a bunch of faceless characters. You can't really identify anybody in it. And they're shouting things and kind of fighting. And it all sort of felt like a cheap version of an Avengers epic. And to me, I don't need to see another Avengers film. So I wasn't quite sure why a company would replicate the tropes of Hollywood when generative AI makes it possible to tell other kinds of stories. And one of the points you just made that I want to emphasize here is if the cost of creation goes down, then you should take greater risk. Because the likelihood is, if you lower the cost, you're able to take more risk, and you might just have a hit. You talked about that distribution before the break. That the cost of innovation is very high right now, and therefore everyone's risk averse. But if the cost comes down, we should be more prone to take risks. So we shouldn't be going for the tried and true action picture, faceless ninjas fighting on motorcycles, whatever. Give me something fresh. And honestly, when you look on Instagram and you see people, they're not really making films, and they're making sort of like faux trailers or just moments from alternate universes. And you see these characters with like super long necks and heads that float and so on. I'm more interested in that world. Like, I would love to see a longer version. It might be boring. It might be kind of fun. But it seems to me that that's a dimension I'd like to explore. So let me shift the conversation from creators and YouTube people and Instagram people to screenwriters and showrunners who I believe, frankly, right now should be immersing themselves in generative AI. And I know some people are. For instance, the showrunner for House of David on Amazon Prime, John Irwin, is very committed to generative AI. He's like personally interested in it. And I think if you were a showrunner today, to not be immersing yourself in the possibilities of generative AI as a storytelling tool, or a tool to aid storytelling, I should say, then I think you're making a blunder. I think it's actually professional malpractice, because this should be a gigantic unlock for storytellers. Respond to that. Tell me what your take is, thinking of it from the perspective of a professional writer or showrunner.
Yeah, what he said.
Okay, fine. Then let's push on. Talk about directors.
It's just.
No, let's talk about directors.
I agree 100%. Is that the ultimately showrunners and screenwriters are beholden to the people who have the money historically, right? They're beholden to the people who have money to make their vision. And then there's always a cost to do that. Again, understandably, from the person who's providing the money, they're going to want to have a say. This is an opportunity to be unshackled from that, to create your own vision, to not have someone giving you notes, to taking your own risks. So yeah, I think that it's a huge opportunity for showrunners. And what I could see is you think about that class of showrunners who are kind of technologically progressive and have a little bit of capital and can run parallel projects. Think about like a J.J. Abrams or somebody.
Yeah, or Sheridan.
Sheridan, Favreau, whatever. And for those kinds of people, I was going to say guys, but it doesn't have to be guys. For those kind of folks, I would think this is a really interesting opportunity to do stuff without having to get the blessing, without having to run the gauntlet of the studio process.
So I've talked to 6 showrunners about this. And here's every single one of them has said the same thing. They said, wait, you're telling me I can produce a pilot without dealing with a studio or a development executive? I said, yep. And they said, I'm in. Let's do it. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that when the light bulb goes off and people see that this isn't going to steal their job, at least as it pertains to a writer, but instead it's superpowers to bypass a bunch of gatekeepers, I think that's going to be quite exciting. And maybe that'll lead to more interesting stories. Let's talk about directors now, because slightly different situation here, right? Most directors don't write. They work with writers. Most directors are hired by producers to implement the script, right? So they take the written word and they turn it into pictures. Again, from my standpoint, generative AI is fantastic at that exact task, right? You dump in a bunch of text, you get a bunch of pictures out the other side. You don't like the pictures? Rev it. You can rev it all day long and you'll end up with thousands of pictures. I do this all the time. So like from my standpoint, this is like my hobby now and I love doing it. I'm stunned at the level of resistance, though again, I detect in the last year there's been a shift. And the shift that I see is precisely age-based. Younger directors are really interested. Older directors know their process. They know the crew they want to work with. They have a method of telling a story. And candidly, they're established directors. They can get greenlit. They can make a movie. So they don't really need this, right? So it's like a generational shift. A younger rising generation of directors, and I would add storytellers who can't get greenlit, and that would include underrepresented audiences or the historically misrepresented, the people who've been neglected. These voices are going to get heard now because they can bypass gatekeepers, similar concept. So I start to see a split. And the evidence I would use to support that is James Cameron. Here is the most technologically astute director and also obviously one of the most successful filmmakers in history, maybe the most successful. He doesn't really need generative AI, yet he's enthusiastically in support of it. And in one specific way, he wants to use it to reinforce studio production on a set, on a soundstage. He wants to streamline that process with better pre-visualization and on-the-spot visualization and some of the other things you talked about, real-time generation and so forth. But what he's not doing is saying, I'm going to do away with the studio, do away with the actors, do away with the camera. No, he actually wants to reinforce it. So I see a split coming where I think the benefits of generative AI in pre-production speak for themselves. They're going to streamline and collapse that process, make it faster, better, richer visualization. And then you get to the point where you go to principal photography. Folks like James Cameron are going to use this as a way to streamline cost, but reinforce. That's like a sustaining innovation for traditional filmmaking. Other folks, and I believe it's a younger generation, that's my premise. Other folks are going to say, no, let's bypass the soundstage, the actors, and the camera. Let's just do it all on a computer. Give me a response to that. Do you see that split coming?
I think it's going to be a continuum. You could have, because there's a middle ground even between those two, where you could say, I'm going to bring in actors. We're going to shoot in a high school auditorium. We're going to shoot
with an iPhone.
the simplest soundstage you could imagine, and then we're going to have real humans. But then we're going to have synthetic costumes and synthetic makeup and synthetic everything else. So I think I agree with the premise. I think there's a big difference between taking generative AI and trying to plug it into existing workflows. And I think the kind of benefits you're going to get from that will be okay to marginal to okay, and then there's going to be other people who come in with a clean piece of paper and say we're starting from scratch. You think about like animation, and today you have a 3D modeler, and you have a texture, and you have a rigger, and you have a colorist, and whatever. And now you're going to come in with Gen AI to those people and say, okay, now we're going to institute these new tools, and everyone's like, well, okay, but wait, what is my job? And so what if your job was you're an artist, that you're actually now going to oversee a character from concept through final render or whatever. Like you're going to have to redefine the roles of what people do. So yeah. I think that's
some of the resistance, by the way. A lot of people are good at their craft and they don't want to learn a new role. They don't want to learn a new skill. They're quite comfortable with their craft. The way Evan Shapiro, not Shapiro, says it, he says, he said, you can make a choice. If you don't want to learn or master the new skill or adapt or change, then you'll keep your share of a declining market.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time.
Anyway, the conversation premise, but I think there is, there's a Gen AI you use the phrase sustaining innovation. It can be deployed in a sustaining way, or it can be deployed in a disruptive way. I think you're going to see both happen, and ultimately you have I talk about this concept of you have progressive synthesization, right? And you have progressive control, right? And progressive synthesization.
Tough one to say.
Tough one to say.
Synthesization.
You're taking physical things, you're taking physical workflows, and you're systematically adding synthetic elements. And then coming at it from the other direction is you start out with something that is 100% synthetic, right? Like the initial video models were basically slot machines. You put in a prompt, you press a button, you see what you get. And they've been adding more, they're systematically adding more creative control. And so you have these two things moving toward each other from opposite directions. One adding control on top of 100% synthetic, and something adding more synthetic on top of 100% control. So where they meet and where do we define the spaces between them? Where does the industry settle out? I think it's hard to say that right now.
Well, let's talk about one group that's definitely caught right in the gun sights of that. And that group is the actors, the screen actors. 250,000 members of the U.S. Screen Actors Guild, and they are adamantly opposed to the use of AI, particularly the forced use of AI. They do not want their names and likenesses and voices cloned without permission or without consent or compensation. I think it's a very reasonable position because that's existential for them. Well, a moment ago, we talked about how it would be a great power for writers who learn how to master this. Unfortunately for an actor, if they take your voice print and face print and they can replicate you in endless situations, this is not a very good outcome. So the actors are opposed. You mentioned, and in some of your writing, you've written actually eloquently about this. Justine Bateman has said it's all about greed. That's the perspective. Something's being taken away from me without thinking about, well, what might it be giving you? And Nicolas Cage's quote, I love this. He said, all integrity, beauty, and truth will be replaced by financial interests. And I love this because it's coming from an actor, right? This is coming from the guy who did Gone in 60 Seconds. All beauty, integrity, and truth.
Yeah,
So oh, is that what that's what actors are all about? I always thought they were about simulating stuff and fakeness, but okay, fair enough. They're the arbiters of truth, truth and beauty. But he has a point. He has a really important point, which is the more we develop an affinity for simulation and the more we develop a tendency to absorb synthetic content as if it's real, that seems to be affecting us as a culture, as a society. It seems to be splitting the United States, at least, into different factions who have completely different belief systems, and some of those belief systems are completely unmoored from reality, from like external objective reality, if there is such a thing. So maybe Nicolas Cage is onto something here. Maybe what we're being conditioned to is a synthetic version of reality that is unmoored from the truth. Yeah, there's your mind bomb, explosive concept for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the way I think about this, because I think about this through the prism or through the lens of the consumer definition of quality that we were talking about earlier. If you think about quality as this algorithm, it's the attributes that people weigh when they make choices. When you go out and make a media choice, sometimes human authenticity is a critical element of the decision, and sometimes it's not, right?
Yeah.
Like if you think about it, media is an emotional good. You make a media choice most of the time not to learn something, not to be informed, but because you're trying to feel something. And so sometimes oftentimes that feeling, it requires that you believe there's an authentic human connection there, that a human is relaying to you some sort of lived experience. I mean, there's some cases where it's more explicit than that, where there's some cases where the experience of the content is inextricably tied to the backstory and the provenance. Like when you watch A Complete Unknown, the fact that Timothy Chalamet, I can never say that guy's name, the fact that he spent 5 years learning to play the guitar and sing Bob Dylan songs is a critical part of the experience. You wouldn't want to listen to Taylor Swift without a knowledge of her relationship history, or when you watch a Quentin Tarantino film, like he's so unabashedly geeky about loving film, like it's part of the experience, right? So there's times when. So I think, I think about this through the lens of the consumer and what is the consumer actually trying to achieve. And there are a lot of times in media when you care deeply about that authentic human connection. And I think it's an open question. AI can never convey an authentic emotion. It could evoke emotion. It could synthesize. It could create. It could mimic emotion, but it can't actually convey a lived experience, right? So I think that.
Okay, let me stop you right there for a second.
I'll just give you one example, and then I'll let you ask your question, which is, it's something that I've heard. So Chris Dixon is this, probably of him, and he has this line that I've heard him say a couple of times, is that computers are demonstrably, unequivocally better than people at chess, but chess is more popular than ever, watching two people play chess, and nobody wants to watch two computers play chess, because what you care about is the human drama under, for the same reason I don't think people are going to want to watch synthetic sports, it's so I think that it becomes this question, like when your question is, are we moving into this more synthetic society? And I think the answer is, maybe we are. I think when you think about, so like I met a guy who does a lot of like DIY. He has a business where he does a lot of DIY videos on YouTube, and I'm like, that business is toast, because there is no, you're just trying to teach someone how to regroute their bathroom or change the battery in their key fob or whatever it is that you're doing. There's no authentic human connection there. That's purely conveyance of information. So the way I think about it is like, docudramas, true crime, historical content. Like, I think that stuff is very susceptible to being made synthetic. And I think things where there's this kind of authentic human connection, I think that's going to be tougher to make synthetic.
Okay, let me push back a little here because it'll make the conversation more fun.
Sure.
So I think for many years, I would say going back to 1995, major media has been pushing an alternative universe, a perspective that has nothing to do with authentic human connection or anything related to like the way people really are. Effectively, what they're doing is, with reality, they're turning the world into a soap opera. They're over dramatizing things, or maybe it's melodrama. That they're selling. They're selling. Maybe this goes back to radio plays, so maybe it's a 100-year-old phenomenon. But certainly, I can date it back to what we call reality TV. And that term reality is a really interesting choice of words, because these shows have so very little to do with reality. That distinction is really there so they don't have to pay writers royalties. I mean, effectively,
Right.
That's the only reason why it's reality and not scripted. They are scripted. There's a producer who's effectively the writer, and it's all orchestrated. And I now see that we have a national government that is run like a reality TV show by a reality TV star, and they're lighting up the whole switchboard every single day with outrage in the same way that a reality show is designed to do. It's like maximizing the emotional intensity, but it's all simulated and it's all stimulated and none of it's natural. So my perception here is that, we tend to think, the media industry is getting blown up or Hollywood's over or something. I think it's more pervasive, more powerful than ever. We immerse ourselves in these worlds, these story worlds. Even when we think we're talking about reality or the news or something, what we're really dealing with is an alternate reality that's been constructed for us. Our discovery is really somebody else's invention. And this is the world we've opted into. No one's forcing this on us. We seem to crave it. And I would argue that we crave heightened emotion, artificial emotion, more than we actually crave human connection. Now, I'll stop right there. We're kind of running out of time, but I definitely don't want to end it without you getting a chance to at least respond.
No, I think that's all fair. I guess one thing where I would kind of push back is that I don't disagree with you that there's this sort of funhouse mirror version of reality that's created, but there's at least a pretense of authenticity behind it. Like, the Kardashians are real people, and people want to go and follow Kendall and Kylie and know who they're dating and all that sort of stuff. That they're actually real humans, even if there's part of what you're if you think about it's interesting also to think about what is the what are the critical attributes of quality for a reality show? And sometimes you'd say, I'm looking for something that makes me feel good about myself. I want to feel superior, right? That's why I'm watching. I want to watch someone who's a hot mess who I can make fun of, and I want to watch the Real Housewives of New Jersey and oh my God, I can't believe these are real people, and they're so outrageous, blah blah blah. But underneath it is still the idea that they're real people, even if it's manufactured, even if it's not really unscripted, it's semi-scripted or whatever, even if the producers have created volatile combinations of humans just to ensure that there's some kind of drama, they're still people. So I don't know. I think it's, but by the same token, if you look at the increasing use of VFX in like sci-fi, there's a lot of that stuff. The Avengers, you could film probably most of the Avengers on a computer. Meaning
For sure.
There's
For sure. And actually, let's be clear.
Mandalorian.
No movies are made that are not touched by CGI. Like, even a historical drama now is loaded with CGI and VFX.
So I think it's going to require a very fine-tuned understanding of what it is that the consumer is trying to achieve when making that media choice.
I think we're going to see this. I think I'm going back to Nicolas Cage's comment about our beauty and truth, and you talked about humans. Humans, there's attributes of humans that you're maintaining. I'm putting words in your mouth that computers will never be able to replicate entirely. Human emotion, human desire, human passion, human ingenuity, human warmth, perhaps. And I'm gonna just throw this last grenade out there. So my observation is that AI boyfriends and girlfriends are going to be a thing. That a rising generation is going to opt for them because they're not equipped to deal with people and all the mess that comes with dealing with another person. And as a result, we're going to start to see a rising generation around the world, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, with more and more families that have a single child, not two, which means that this is the end of siblings and the end of cousins. So that means 2 generations from now, we're going to have society, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, is going to be conditioned to being a singleton and having very little ability to have another person in their life in close proximity, sharing a bedroom, sharing a bed. I think that generation is going to be highly susceptible to AI-generated friends. And they might find them more responsive, more pliable, maybe more interesting, maybe more exciting, maybe easier to deal with. And if you don't want it, you can just turn it off and be by yourself. So I know this is starting to sound like an episode of Dark Mirror, but isn't that a great way to end? Like, we're going for the totally bleak scenario here. It's not the end of Hollywood, it's the end of society. Feel free to opine. Otherwise, we can wrap it up for the day.
Yeah, that sure seems like a pretty nihilistic.
I think it's a golden opportunity for somebody who doesn't mind.
Maybe you're not if Elon Musk has his way, right? Like he's trying to get people to procreate more. I don't know. It's a pretty scary thought, but
we can accept the billionaires. The children of billionaires will be able to reproduce.
I guess if we're worried about, it seems like in society we're worried about 2 conflicting things. One is that AI is going to take all the jobs, and the second one is that there won't be enough people. So maybe those 2 things actually work well in tandem.
Well, Doug, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. Tell me, how can people find you on the web? People who've heard this, who are fascinated by Doug Shapiro, where can they find you?
Best place is probably my Substack, The Mediator.
Okay. And what's that URL?
That's a really good question.
Okay, so if you just search, folks,
I think it's like
search Substack for Doug Shapiro.
It's not the most elegant URL. I think I think maybe the Google search bar is a good. Or
that's fine.
You could link to it in the show notes.
We will do so, and if you're listening, search Doug Shapiro Substack, The Mediator, and it'll show up. I guarantee you. I've enjoyed it immensely. This is a great conversation. I've been looking forward to talking to you, like I said, for a year. And for the folks who are listening, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please do me a favor, post a 5-star review on whatever podcasting service you listen to. It really helps other people discover the show. And I want to give a warm welcome to all the new listeners we've had this year. It's been growing and growing, and that's a great sign. So thank you for that. Seems like an endorsement. I'm very happy to take it. And to all our old listeners who've been with us since the beginning, we're thrilled to do this. We've been enjoying the show. I'll be back soon with Brett King, and we'll bring you another futurist. And until then, I'll see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.